Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I want to thank Easy Micro, of course, for having me out to do this. It is a company that I got to know through the kindness of being patient with me breaking my computer repeatedly when I was at the mission. Him too. So the background of what Hillary kind of touched on, my mother would have you believe I was an old soul. She was into getting her cards read when we were young, and it was a very odd experience when she'd come back, but that was a statement she would say. And so my ability to understand and discern the rhythm of chaos and help people identify within themselves kind of came natural. So I've spent 20 years in the human service field, doing everywhere from frontline juvenile correction and mental health to the directorship of faith-based organizations. In that time frame, there is, and as anybody knows, a fair amount of red tape and dancing you have to do, and other people tell you their version and their vision. And there's quotes that will come flying down the social media pipeline that will tell you about if you don't build your vision, someone else will hire you to build theirs. And I finally had arrived at a point where I had decided it was time for me to do mine. And so the Clover Life Consulting Group was born in that space. And one of the questions I get asked a lot is, why the clover? What does that mean? How does that play into this? Is it just innocuous? Twofold. One, being of Irish heritage, it was something that I resonated with. But two, it was a tool we used when working with juveniles who had arrived at a certain level of self-awareness and had decided they were going to take what they had learned forward. And so it's symbolic of the friendship, love, loyalty, and then the fourth leaf of the four-leaf clover was whatever was specific to them that they took away from the relationship that they wanted to bring into the world. And so as I created this idea, that seemed like a natural thing to do. And so I bring all that here today. It was encouraging to hear some of the thoughts that everybody had shared, because there's going to be something that I touch on just about everything of those with. And as we go, please ask questions, share thoughts, make jokes, whatever. We're here to enjoy our afternoon and to all grow and learn together. To start off with, the approach I take to sharing the concept, in terms of being a leader, it's important to first start to understand what drives the human condition and what makes us all the same and different, because there is a platform experience that we all have and we all move from in different ways that will result in our leadership styles, both in our life as parents, as a husband, and as anybody that supervises people. This diagram will show you, shows you specifically how human beings make a decision. 9 times out of 10, you will experience something first, which is usually a feeling. We have 5 senses for that purpose. The senses serve to keep us alive as a biological element. But you will have an experience first. You ever have the hair on your back of your neck go up, or your gut tells you something's not right? That's your body keying you in to the fact that you need to pay attention to something that's going on that you haven't consciously seen yet. Your brain will then go from that experience to then consciously starting to evaluate what's taking place. What am I seeing? Then you will start to negotiate the landscape, the people, and if it's a leadership role, for instance, you're going to start to go backwards and revisit their body language, their tone of voice, the mood they were in, what were they wearing. I mean, you can go as deep as you want to figure out what was off on that. And you're going to use past experience to evaluate that. Part of that is understanding people's specific rhythms and being able to address them where they are and not use a broad stroke, everybody fits in the same box. From that process, you decide what to do next. And so this is a process that we use to decide what we're going to have for breakfast, who we're going to marry, if we're going to stay employed. And it's important to realize that anybody you're leading is doing the same exact thing. And so one of the goals of today's presentation is to teach the idea of ownership of outcome, meaning that if you want the result, you have to own the input. And you have to own the outcome in a way that isn't excuse-driven. And a lot of times, because of emotional charging, that gets in the way of us, because a lot of times we want to kind of throw our staff under the bus for non-performance in a certain process. So the foundational place that I usually start in explaining this, as I just went through, is that's essentially the process that everybody will go through at any moment they need to make a decision. And the reason that we do this process is because we are hardwired to find the fastest path to comfort. Universally, that is the primary function of our five senses. As a species, it's to stay alive. As a conscious thinking being, comfort is something that is negotiated on the fly consistently. In the process of breakfast, for instance, if you are hungry, it's the time of day, you're going to realize I'm hungry, I'm going to go look at what food I have, and I'm going to pick the thing that's going to make me the most satisfied. That process drives everything we do on a daily basis in microspaces and in the long game. Becoming aware of that and how we delay that gratification process is where we run into some successes and some headaches. Knowing that about the people you lead is also important because they're not going to be aware of that process to the degree which you might be. Does anybody have any questions on any of those concepts? Anything that stands out? I'm going to kind of explain where it all starts. So, how it all comes to be. So, when a baby is born, everybody got born, that's why we're here. We go from dark to light, we go from warm to cold, and we go from never knowing hunger to starving. Now, typically, in a perfect world, what happens when a baby goes through that? Well, the first experience on this planet, you get made warm, you get fed, and they put the little beanie over your eyes, and you get nuzzled up to mom, and you knock out, and you go right back to comfort. In that space, the baby cries. It's a distress signal. So instinctually, we are all wired to express distress because we are uncomfortable. And the first lesson we all learned was if I freak out, the world takes care of me. That's our natural hardwiring. And it's reinforced right out of the gate. We spend the next roughly 2 years having that fortified. That's where it says the results. You believe you're the center of the universe. Because anybody that has kids knows that every time they freak out, what do? You go running. And it's not wrong. It's normal. But at some point, you want to jump out of the window because you want to start to get like, hey, can you take care of yourself a little bit? When are we going to be able to kind of handle this a little bit? Because we're going through our own discomfort. But that's fortified for the first 2 years. Now, baby doesn't consciously express itself knowing that the result's going to be comfort. And so understanding that about people helps you start to then understand what you're observing. Because if you're, for instance, running a crew and it's raining out, so landscaping is something I used to do and I love it, so I can understand not wanting to go out in the rain, for instance, and run a zero turn on a sloped hill with bare tread on the tires. And if I get pushback, it's going to be there's discomfort and fear behind why they're pushing back. And so it's being able to sort through what you're seeing and getting to the core source of the resistance so you can then apply an accommodating solution to that regard. And sometimes it is, well, sorry, you got to do it, but sometimes it could be something deeper that you can talk through and have a better understanding of. So from that space, we go for the first 2 years, and you're constantly affirmed that you are the most important thing. But eventually in growth, we hit the terrible twos, and the magic word no arrives. And so this is a critical time of development for people in general, and it does translate to leadership styles down the line. If you do not learn how to delay your gratification for a greater gain, you will believe that you continue to be the center of the world, and therefore you will continue to engage the world in a way that forces the fastest path to comfort. Period. That's why kids throw tantrums at 2. I didn't get my way, I'm going to continue to freak out because generally that gets me what I want. And if that process doesn't find its mark, people are going to struggle when they get later in life with delaying gratification. And in today's society, if anybody again has children that has technology, for instance, as I speak on there, that encourages that fastest path to comfort. They're not learning how to use the 5 senses to create internal comfort, which is how we're designed. And so technology interferes with the growth process. The intended results after 2 and beyond is that we learn the value of relationship. We learn that there's a greater gain to be had through delaying the immediate satisfaction of life, and that there are things that are much more important than us. Now again, if it doesn't take its mark, you will find probably statistically most people will fall into a realm of addictive behavior, addictive patterns, because again, that's the fastest path to comfort. Why does anybody use? Why does anybody drink? They're trying to make pain go away. That's a result of something. Why do people get in arguments and fights? Why do people say no? Well, because it's uncomfortable to believe that our ego is not correct, and so we will defend it. So from there, we're going to examine the five senses and how it interferes and involves in the growth process. Now, it's different leading younger generations because their time and their involvement is through that magic box, and their struggles to understand delayed gratification comes from not having instant access to the internet, whereas I am young enough to not have had that when I grew up. It's a whole different way of operating. And so the impact of the technology is that they are robbing themselves the opportunity to have all five senses communicate the sense of threat to themselves and how to evaluate their landscape. So they're only using 2 versus 5, which limits their ability to make decision-making and informed decisions. You go through the progress of how technology and communications have gone. The Pony Express, you had months to get a letter, process it, and write it back. And then you had to wait for the response, process it, write it back. The telephone increased that. So now, and I think everybody can probably resonate with this, how many times you get in a fight with your spouse because they sent you a text message and you applied a meaning to it of which wasn't accurate? Because you felt something from earlier and you assumed that that's what we were talking about, so you fired one back like that. Having communication at the fingertips skews the perception and the perspective that we process communication with each other. That's one of the things about leadership. How do you communicate to your team? If it's in writing, they're going to read it through whatever experience they have with you. So if you just took their head off in a meeting, or you came in even just looking like you're in a bad mood, if you send out a corrective or a standard, they're going to process that through, he's in a bad mood, that's why he sent it. They're not going to hear the expectation, they're going to hear the emotion. And so the awareness in that allows us to become more cognizant of how we present and create the experience we have with the teams we lead and with our family. Family is a whole different dynamic. Emotions being as they are, as that says, they are excellent messengers, but they are terrible managers. So emotions, by their design and intention, are there to let us know that something is off, that something is uncomfortable. You need to evaluate, you need to address. They are also extremely temporary, and they hit hard and fast, and they snag you deep, and they become the truth. They become you. That's why we will defend ourselves, why we'll have arguments, why we will push back on a direction we're given, is because that's my experience. That's me. You can't tell me I'm wrong. But the problem is that interpretation becomes your truth and doesn't mean it is the truth. And it takes some time to unpack and remove that emotional hook to understand what's really being seen. And in that space, you're also going to create a narrative to allow you to be accepted by your proverbial tribe. So if we take the social landscape of our society and politics, whatever side you're talking about, it's so that other people that are like-minded of you will accept you, because that's how we're bred. We're meant to be communal animals, and therefore we're going to seek acceptance from those who think like us. And emotions govern that. And as soon as you create a narrative on an emotion, the intensity of it triples like that. Then you start, anybody ever do this? You ruminate, you're going to get in an argument, and you go to one of your friends, you're like, did you believe? And then you tell the story you're going to tell the person that you're going to tell, and then you keep telling it to whoever wants to listen, and then you finally create and seek out that environment where you can finally tell that person what you feel. That's where that comes from, is because your emotions become your truth. And in that space, you get blinded. We only see objects based upon the distance they are from us. And so if your emotions are constantly here, you're never going to be able to put it in perspective to what's around you. The 3 types of people that generally falls into: heart, head, and gut people. Heart people own everyone else's experience. Anybody that's married knows that if your spouse is having a bad day, you're by default having a bad day. If they are in conflict with another family member, you by default are in conflict with another family member. There are folks that will run away with it and make it their own experience. Again, they do that because of wanting to be accepted and be included. But the problem is they don't actually have their own emotions. They're always taking someone else's. And therefore, they're never consistent in their presentation. And if you're leading anyone like that, it makes it very difficult for you to understand what you're going to see the next time something else comes up. I had a college roommate that was very much like this. He would take on the coolest personality in the group constantly. So I can say to this day, living with him for 3 years, I don't know who he was, because he constantly morphed into who was the most accepted person around us. Ironically, he works in Hollywood doing movies. Head people, right? They're the other end of the spectrum. They rationalize everything, so that way they don't have to have an emotion. If there's a logical way to deduce what's taking place, I don't have to invest an emotional response to it. Therefore, it's dealt with, compartmentalized, and I move forward. But again, void of emotion. They don't have one because they have assigned a thought and a process to it, not an experience. And then the gut people. I'm very much a gut person to a degree. Like, so everything I'm saying and doing right now, it's just coming from what I understand and what I know. It's not pre-written. A head person would have written this all down, and a heart person probably would have more movies and more huggy, kissy kind of stuff involved in all this stuff. But gut people like myself, and again, remember, this all falls on a spectrum. This isn't hard and fast. They want to engage stuff as quickly as they can to create a sense of order and control to it and put it in a place and perspective to the rest of things so that the next thing can come. The problem and danger with that, everything, and we all know these, everything's just too much. It's too hard. Life is too this, it's too that. You can feel overwhelmed very easily. So it does take a bit of self-awareness and negotiation in that process to do that. Jim?
We're all kind of tuned into this thing called emotional intelligence now. I understand it. I really like this slide because I've never looked at it this way. Is there a publication or something that you may have with some more information about that? Because I love three general types of folks. Really will help you deliver to your people their own emotional intelligence. I really like it.
So that was a concept taken from, I believe the book is called Breathing Underwater.
Breathing Underwater.
I think that was the one. Richard Rohr, who is a French, he's a priest, spoke about this at length and categorized people in that process to help us understand. And he's very much a gut person, according to him.
Thank you.
An example of emotional miscommunication is anxiety and depression. Now, in society, this is a large concept that governs everyone to a degree. The truth be told is that everyone has one or the other at some point, whether it's chronic or situational. It's just a word applied to explain the body and the brain's communication to deal with distress. Now, to make this point of emotions and the five senses coming together. So depression is the slow slide into preservation of self. So if you think about physical trauma, if somebody gets hurt, somebody gets in a car accident, for instance, and their body's all jacked up, one of the first things that EMTs will deal with is shock. Somebody goes into shock, the whole body shuts down, all the blood goes from extremities and all that to preserve the core functioning systems. Depression is that same process. It is the brain not communicating to the body that it's safe. So whatever it might be, the brain, its job, give consciousness to threat. So it will evaluate the landscape of life, it will identify, it will communicate to the body what to do to create safety, and you move. Normally that can happen with fluidity, and it's not much of an issue. Anybody that has significant trauma will struggle with that, because if they give consciousness to the feeling of unsafe and fear, their conscious brain will ignore it. But the body knows. That's where the five senses come in. That's where the five sense feedback comes in. The body will store that in its functionality, and it will keep peppering the brain to say, hey, what's going on? I know there's a threat. And the brain will say, stop talking to me, go away, we're not talking about this. And the body says, okay, well, we're not going to move until you do, because that's what I do. So until you tell me what to do, I'm just going to do what I'm programmed to do. That's why people lose appetite. That's why people sleep a lot. That's why the motivation takes a nosedive. Those are all biologically driven ideas that the body's hardwired to do to preserve itself from a perception of threat. And if the brain doesn't acknowledge it, that miscommunication will continue to be that way until the conscious mind finally engages and identifies what the body is sensing. It's not an easy task, but that's what generally takes place. Anxiety is the other side of that spectrum. It's the brain anticipating the threat, the body panicking, saying what's going on. The brain says, I don't know, I can't deal with it, just go to sleep. So the heart rate goes up, Your blood pressure goes up, the breathing rate goes up, and then boom, good night, you pass out. That's the body shutting down because the brain can't say we're safe, we're good, move forward. As you go through figuring out how to deal with your team, it is important to understand when you present information, this might trigger some of those kinds of reactions. At the end of the day, as the leader, you have to know how you speak to them, how the relationship is built, is going to be interpreted through past experience. Leadership is not a role, it's not a title, it is a mindset. If you don't want to build more leaders, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage because your motivation has already been diluted. If you don't want your team's success, you're shooting yourself in the foot. One of the things that we talk about in terms of leadership is decentralized command. And so as you had referenced, putting on a lot of hats. Leadership development, and you know from the military, you have to build up your leadership team below you to be able to execute. If they are not executing and they're not performing as a leader, it's your fault. Plain and simple. And that's the hard truth about leadership that generally gets passed because, and I just witnessed this with somebody a few days ago. There's an executive director I was in a meeting with a funder, and she threw her team under the bus because the grant wasn't getting met. I was shocked. I was sitting, I was like, and that's like 101. You don't throw your team under the bus. No matter how bad it's going, you don't tell somebody else outside of that they're not performing. And then they went into the agency and proceeded to tell the subordinates the same message and added yet another former staff member of which they were close with. When I spoke to that team afterwards, I said, does anybody have any opinions or thoughts on what you saw? Every single one of them said, if she's going to do that to them, she's definitely going to do it to me. That space in and of itself will not promote loyalty. That doesn't promote the fact that I care about you, I care about your experience, and I will do everything I can to equip you to be successful at what you do. Because if you don't care about your team's development and their success and their role, you are by default removing a resource which will be highly effective to you as the overall leader. You have to own the outcome. And so if you give clear expectation, and having been in leadership, and Mike can speak to this because he was somebody I had to supervise for a while, if I gave him directions and I equipped him and I did all this stuff, and if he came back and said it didn't work or didn't happen, I had to own that fact because I was the one that told him how to do it. Right? I mean, there is certain user error, but a lot of times if he didn't get it, means I didn't communicate effectively. And it's a very instinctual thing to want to put it back on the person who didn't do it. Because who wants to have egg on their face, right? Who wants to sit there and own the fact that my team didn't do it, therefore it's my fault? No, it's their fault. They're the ones there. I told them how to do it. I explained it. Humility as a leader is the most paramount element to do this. And so if your team doesn't execute, for instance, and they come back and they say something like, I didn't have the proper amount of money, or I didn't have the proper materials. The responses are, next time I should have equipped you better. Next time I should have thought about this or done that. Because in that space of humility, you're owning their situation. You're not blaming them. But in that conversation, you're also clarifying, you still could have done it. But I'm going to own it. And I'm going to take ownership of your success. That inspires that loyalty and that connection piece that is important when trying to get folks to do large-scale, small-scale enterprises. Because if you don't feel believed in, you don't feel loved, you don't feel a human connection, you're not going to do it. Everybody in this room has experienced good and bad leadership, right? You know it when you see it. Good leadership you don't notice until it's already passed you by. Because when it's done right, you are successful and you don't even realize who to attribute it to. And Jim is a great example of that for me. His leadership for me was such that I was monitored but encouraged. I wasn't babysat, I wasn't taught, but I was encouraged and equipped and held accountable. By the time I realized my successes, I'd had no idea that it was actually his doing. Whereas other bosses, you know right away, like you wouldn't follow them down the block, let alone at the gates of hell. Not in the slightest bit. Because of how they speak, because of their character, how they carry themselves, how you watch them talk about other people. So if you're in that role, you have to analyze yourself and realize, am I doing that? Am I creating a space within my family or my company where I'm talking smack on somebody because they're my friend? Everybody has their crony at work they'll go and complain to. But you got to remember, as a leader, you set the tone down the line. You say that to one person, I'm promising you 5 to 6 other heard that conversation. Because if you have that with them, they have that with somebody else. And it's hard because you want to be able to vent that frustration. To that degree, forcing and then being aware of every thought and communication through these 3 bullet points will give you an idea of what's really taking place underneath. In life, there is no such thing as can't, in the sense of mindset and movement. Like, you can't breathe underwater without an apparatus. You can't walk through a solid object 9 times out of 10 and come out of it the other side. You can't fly unsustained without help. But generally everything else, it's a won't. You ever find yourself in an argument, I can't apologize? Sure you can. You don't want to. Or dieting, I can't stop eating. Sure you can. You just don't want to. The truth of that messaging is, it's not right or wrong, but it's honest. If your staff comes to you and says, I can't do this, unless it's any of the previous things or there's legitimately an absent element, they don't want to do it. So then it's our job to figure out, what is the resistance? Why don't they want to do this? And a lot of times it's an opinion. I don't think this is a good idea. We've already tried this. This is, it's usually a thought-based resistance. But it is a won't. They'll hide behind can't because there's no ownership. I can't do it, it's not my fault. Well, truth be told is, no, you don't want to do it, which is fine. But phrase it that way. If you hear their language presenting that way, you'll understand how to unpack it and how to really dig a little bit deeper. And as Hillary would reference, picking up on the use of language, and particularly with her, would allow me to start kind of chip away at what was really driving the thought, because it's awareness of language. The idea of should versus will. Should is a projection, which quite honestly is a lie we just throw out in the wind and hope somebody believed it to get out of that conversation. It proposes the idea that, like, I know it's a good idea, I should do it, like I should exercise. I don't want to exercise because that means I got to get up with the birds and make myself uncomfortable on purpose, which defeats the hardwiring. I don't want to be uncomfortable on purpose because honestly, exercising isn't that important to me, so therefore I don't want to. I'm not going to. Speaking to yourself and to your team that way allows truth. Applying a positive or a negative is a whole different ballgame, but it's the truth. And it's okay to say, I don't want to do something. My wife goes nuts with that stuff because I'll get in these rhythms of getting up before 4:30 in the morning, I'll go work out, I'll do all these things, and she's a runner and much more enthusiastic about moving things than I am. But as soon as I fall off, she stops. And then I get the lecture. You should be getting up to exercise. I don't want to exercise. But you should. I know I should. I don't want to. And I'm okay with not wanting to because I'd rather be comfortable in bed when it's 40 degrees in the garage where the treadmill is. Well, I need to exercise. The last piece. You don't need to do anything. That's the difference. There's no need in life. You don't need to eat. You want to eat so you don't die, but you don't need to. Those are the kinds of valuations that when you're dealing with your teams and even with your spouse or anybody that you spend a lot of time with, listening to how they speak about what they're talking about reveals their true intention of cooperation or belief in what they're talking about, what they're feeling. How you react to it goes back to the emotional intelligence Jim was talking about. How do you evaluate it through the experience you've had with him? What's the end game? What's the point? What's the relationship dynamic? What's the purpose? It does require the humility piece of coming low and trying to understand the motives. A lot of times they don't realize it because they're working from a space of discomfort. If they're bringing it to your attention, something's wrong. If they stop bringing it to your attention, they either stop believing in you or they think you don't care. One of the books that I took a lot out of in terms of my own recent evaluation and process was the book, as it's revealed, Extreme Ownership, which is written by Jocko Willink. and Leif Babin, who are former SEALs that fought in Ramadi. And it has gained a lot of traction socially because it cuts out the emotional nonsense of us allowing ourselves to be the victim of our own thinking. And it creates the dichotomies necessary to understand how to effectively engage people. One of the ones that leaders can really tread difficultly on is the confidence versus cocky. I know everything, you don't know what you're talking about, and we're successful because I did it. In leadership, you're responsible for the mistakes. Your team is rewarded for their success. That's the way it should be. Anything else, your ego's in play, and you want the accolade, which is normal. Who doesn't want to be embraced and appreciated and validated? Be competitive but gracious in defeat. That means if you have peers in your industry, go head to head with them, give them a good run. But if they top you, your team is watching you. How you handle defeat, bad quarters, bad outcomes will define how they do the same. So if you go in your office and slam the door and lose your cookies because it didn't hit the first quarter numbers or somebody else got a contract, you can rest assured they're going to trickle that down the line. They're going to talk to their subordinates or their peers in the same context because they're going to be afraid that it's going to come down the pike back to them. Being attentive to detail but not obsessed. Does anybody like being micromanaged? It's frustrating. It's smothering. Makes you feel incompetent. It's almost to the point of like, well, then you do it. If you think, why am I here? Why am I even doing this? You do it then. Because it's insulting. Because it's a passive-aggressive way of saying, you're not competent enough to do this. So let me spoon-feed it to you. To do it correctly, your team needs to know where the boundaries are. What are the parameters of operation? When do they break the rules and when don't they? Because they should understand the philosophy of what they're doing and know your general ideas and expectations of conduct. So they should be reporting back, here's how far we got, this is where you want us to go. Should I engage A, B, or C? Versus, I don't know what to do next. And it takes time because you got to know your team and develop those relationships where they can bring it to you. Being a leader and a follower is a difficult one because there's an ego in play. It is a rhythm. I enjoy working in teams mainly because I don't always have to have the answer. A lot of times when people ask me what my role is, I'll say I'm not the boss, I'm the guy that has to be accountable for the decision. I don't know everything. Sitting in this room right now, if we were to do a task of problem solving, it's better to have this many brains than just this one. The number of experiences that sit in this room far exceed what I could think of on my own. And honestly, as a leader, I want as many people speaking into the situation as I can, but ultimately it's up to me and my discernment to decide what the best move is next. Being okay with that doesn't take you out of leadership role. It demonstrates the humility of leadership. To say, I trust you to do this. And if you've done that, you will equip them to do the next one without hesitation. You'll find more volunteers because that instills faith in your team. Being aggressive but restrained. So there's a concept called default aggression in leadership. It means if there's an issue, you should attack it aggressively by default. The thought is you shore up the damage it can do, you demonstrate to your team the intensity and vigor of what you want and their level of engaging issues, and it triages the amount of damage you're going to have to deal with on the back. But aggression can also be emotion. It can be anger, frustration. But it is important to respond in a timely manner that demonstrates confidence that you're going to stand in front, not on the top. That's another element of leadership that often gets talked about but not thought about is you lead from the front, not from the top. It's not a top-down thing. Anybody that I've ever followed, I followed them because they went through the door first. They had the guts to take the punch first. And then they would come back and say, when you go through the door, this is what you need to look out for. I appreciated that because they equipped me to anticipate what was coming next. If it's a top-down, well, you're not going to go through that door? Why are you going through that door? If you're not going to go, I'm not going to go. Why should I go? You get paid more than I do. You know more than I do. Shouldn't you be the one taking this? Lead from the front. You set the example. You set the tone in terms of character, in terms of response, content, concept, concern. How do you handle the difficulties? The last one being, and I find this extremely valuable, well, the last two, is you got to be able to detach when it hits the fan. Step back, look at the landscape of what's taking place, and make a call. Make a decision. If you have a group that is constantly in chaos and nobody wants to step forward and make a decision and say, you know what, this is what we're going to do, this is a plan, go, be the one that does it. But you have to detach your emotional frustration with the chaos so you can see the whole picture, evaluate, make a call, and then own the outcome. As a leader, that's your responsibility. Because at the end of the day, if somebody fails and they're under your watch, it's your fault. Unless it's an act of God, 9 times out of 10, it might take 15 to 16 times to get it through. Now, if you go down that road with somebody, you must love them a lot because you still have a job to do and there's certain deadlines that have to be hit. And if somebody just doesn't get it, they don't get it. But there's ways to communicate that.
I feel the need to defend the act of God concept.
That's yeah.
Because it's not always bad.
True. And in the grand scheme of things, it's how it fits into the bigger picture.
It's only bad in the insurance industry, apparently.
Well, that's just in case stuff. We know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. And so how does any of this stuff apply to the personal and the professional? In life, we all have people that are watching us. If you have kids, they're watching every response you make to every stimuli you experience. If you have teams of which all you lead, how you dress, what you eat, what you talk about, I mean everything. They know your life inside and out, whether you think they do or not. One of the things that the place we worked was having to acknowledge the fact that our life was known by every client in that building. They knew every inch of our thoughts and everything we did, whether we did a great job of not doing it or not, just how we carried ourselves. And how willing are we to be transparent? So there's certain elements to that that have a correcting versus a teaching. You know, correcting is, I know better. You know, when we go back to having kids and you go back to the 2-year-old, you're doing a lot of correcting because they're acting on instinct. Your job is to correct the channeling of that instinct. Eventually, teaching is able to take place because they can understand the minutiae of things and understand that there's gray matter in the world. And that they can now apply that in different ways. As a leader, discipline, and as a parent, is an act of love. Often it gets a negative connotation. Discipline is an act of anger or disappointment. But it's an act of love because if you never step in with the people that are important to you in your business or your life and tell them you've crossed the line and there's consequences, and I'm telling you this because I want better for you so you don't get hurt, you've abandoned them. And you've told them, I don't care what happens to you, I don't care how successful you are, and you can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter to me. And and as human beings, if we're all left to those devices, well, we're going to find that fastest path to comfort. And I'm not going to follow that person who's telling me. I'm going to go find somebody to complain with because it's going to make me feel good so I can vent my emotional narrative that I just experienced being frustrated. And ultimately, it's going to shoot me in the foot. Now, discipline as an act of love also is an opportunity for restoration and growth. You can't just tell somebody they're wrong. You have to equip them with how to do it right. A lot of times in HR, it's fill out this form. You'll do this and you'll hit these marks, and we'll 3-month reevaluate. As the leader, how often are you checking in with that plan? How often you ask them how they feel about their experience in that plan? Because they're not going to want to fix it just because they got told to. A lot of times in that space, they're negotiating whether the job's even worth it. Like, you know what, forget it. I don't care. I'll move on to something else. But if they know you care about them, that's not a consequence. That's a concern. That's an act of love. And you get to walk alongside them and help them be successful. The casual versus consistent in the personal life is a parenting one, more or less, but also at work. If you let people have an inconsistent experience where boundaries are and you don't hold a standard, they're going to be confused and lost on purpose. And again, what's the messaging in that? I don't really care how good you are at your job. Therefore, I don't really care about the fact that you're here participating. And therefore, they can't execute at a consistent bar and standard. You know, in our house, getting the rooms cleaned with 3 kids is like trying to tame a tornado. But if you don't address it on a daily basis and hold the line on that standard, it's never going to be something that is actually achieved, because it's a reaction versus an action.
I understand the consistent. Could you hit the casual aspect of that?
So the casual side, you know what, fine, go ahead and do it. It's like when the kid or the employee goes inside, you know what, I don't think you're really committed to it. Let me ask you 648 more times. You'll cave, right? I'll avoid the fight, I'll avoid the argument, I'll avoid the annoyance of having to restate my word as my word. And you know what? Just whatever, do it. That's what that looks like in real time. Anybody with kids, you absolutely know it. Anybody that has, it's anybody in their team that constantly comes back and says, yeah, but, we got other things we need to do. So we're going to negotiate our comfort and be like, fine, whatever, fine, just do it.
Can you speak a little bit to casual versus consistent in more like peer-to-peer relationships with spouses, friends, coworkers? Like where you're not kids, you're de facto leading them, you know, more peer-to-peer way. How that
So in that space, it is the expectation of boundary being set. You know, a lot of times we're afraid to offend people or say this makes me uncomfortable. And so we will permit things that takes place in that relationship and send the wrong messaging. You know, so it goes back to, well, you're allowing me to be this close to you. But if that person's that annoyed by, like is annoyed by close talking but doesn't want to offend you, well, they're going to create that inconsistency, and then one time they're going to snap out on it, and that person's like, it's always been like that. You know, how do you message who you are, what you're about, and what standards you're willing to allow applied to your life? You know, and it's a difficult concept because it does present conflict. You know, and so it's like, how do I present love and boundary at the same time to people of which I don't want crossing it, in a way that doesn't disenfranchise them or create a lack of acceptance by the overall tribe, as we talked about earlier. And a lot of people avoid that. People do crazy things to avoid the truth of their soul and their experience, and they will amend themselves and accommodate other people far faster than they will their own truth. And saying like, no, I'm not okay with that, please don't do that. But the truth is, on the other side of that, the self-discipline in that space requires the consistency of setting that stage.
If I'm not consistent in however I want to defend my boundaries, whatever those standards are, then how can I expect the other person to even know
Correct.
where the lines are, right?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And the messaging of that goes back to, why do you want them to know? Because odds are that's not a person-to-person issue. That's your overall struggle in life. Boundaries. Personal, emotional, physical.
I don't know if it totally applies or not, but it's still the same concept. Like I work with dogs a lot,
Mm-hmm.
right? One of the things that a behavior that I do not allow my dogs to do is to jump up on people, whether it's a new face, whether it's somebody they really love and enjoy. If I was casual about that, it'd be okay when Uncle Tom comes over, that the dog is allowed to jump up in his arms and jump at him and everything like that. So that would be my understanding of the confusion between casual and consistent. Like, if I'm gonna be casual with the dog, then I'm gonna expect it to do something that I require of it under certain circumstances, but then different circumstances, I'm gonna allow it to act however it wants or do whatever it wants. But my consistency is, no, Uncle Tom, I know that you really like it when the dog gets up on you like that, but it's not okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know if that's...
And that tempts the relational conflict stuff that most people avoid, because who wants to be uncomfortable and in conflict? It goes against our normal nature of existence. But if you're not messaging it, don't expect people to read your mind on it. And there's ways to communicate it where you're not coming across as a jerk. You know, you can say it in love. I have a job that I work at. There was a gentleman who had a bit of a reputation for violating that behavior in terms of speaking his mind and telling people what to do in departments that weren't his. And it was probably the first couple of weeks I was there. And this isn't when I was working with Jim and them. And he'd done that to me. Got off the phone, said, "Can I talk to you for a second?" "What's up?" I said, "A couple things. Don't ever speak to me that way again. I'd appreciate it. Felt very disrespectful. I communicate in different ways, so if we could go about that way, no problem. I understood your point, but I need you to hear mine. If you have any questions, my desk is over there. Love you." Pat him on the back, walked away. We haven't had a problem since. And we get along. Was it harsh? Could have been. I mean, he might have thought it was. But at the same time, having that moment was much more effective in the long game than doing that daily dance and not wanting to go up to his office because I'm going to have to fight the urge of wanting to bury his head in his desk. Right? So there's those negotiations in our head of, I have to make sure that I'm communicating it clearly and effectively, with consistently. And some people need it more often because they just forget. And some people just need to hear it hard, fast, and up front, and we're good. How you respond after that makes it like, oh wait, no, he wasn't being rude. Like he actually cares about me, but he's being very clear as to what the rules are in this relationship. And that's the leadership part. I'm leading him now in that space because I set the tone. So now we're partners because I made it very clear, here's where my boundaries are. Now, if I came across aggressively, angrily, loudly, drawn out, and revisited, well, then I'm exactly what he thought I was. You know, good leadership requires humility above anything else. The personal walk it out before you talk it out. If you don't demonstrate what you want done in your character and in your function, you cannot expect your team to do what you're not willing to do. And that goes right back to being the first through the door. If you're not willing to walk it out, you can't talk it out. What frame of reference could you possibly have if you never did it? If you have a leader, like, so for instance, when Jim and I worked together, one of the first things he said, he goes, "I've never done what you're about to do, so I'm not going to tell you how to do it." Right then and there, that was a demonstration of respect. So that the rest of the messaging that he was going to put out to me respected my competency and made it clear that I was the expert in the relationship, but that he still had an expectation of me to be good at what I knew. So he couldn't come and correct me in that space because he admittedly said, "I don't know how to do what you're going to do, but I do have an expectation of performance." So if you're leading people and you're not willing to either concede your point and make them the expert, i.e. be the follower, you're going to have a really hard time selling them on the idea that they should follow you because all you have is your word and you have no experience to draw it from. And being authentic as a leader and being transparent are two of the most important things that you can offer the team that you're trying to train up. Same thing in life, friends or otherwise. We covered the boss versus leader, the characteristics, the accountability versus responsibility. You know, at the end of the day, I'm accountable for my team's outcome. They're responsible for functions. If they screw up, they're not accountable for the outcome. I am. Having that mindset makes it a little easier to understand who takes what kind of blame. And so if you got to go and present the outcome of your team, for instance, to a higher up, and they start running you up and down the flagpole, the answer is, that was my fault. I didn't do a good job doing this, that, or the third. This is my plan to respond to that. And then when you go back to your team, you tell them that you just took it on the chin. Not in that way, to make them feel bad, but you go back and say, we didn't hit our mark. It was my fault. Here's what I needed to do better. This is the plan to move forward. Because in that space, they're going to rise to the loyalty that shows because they know you just went and got dressed down pretty good. But you stood in there and took it for them anyway.
I think that James, where that is really expressed is in an example in a group meeting of your leadership team, doesn't matter what levels. If you begin by giving the example of we really messed up, and you share the example of non-accountability to that, if you're truly sincere, every one of them will step right up and accept the honor you and take responsibility for the area they failed.
You know, how many times as a leader or as a spouse or as a friend, you're ready to take somebody's head off that screwed up, cost you something, offended you, and they come to you and apologize to you and take ownership before you're allowed to say anything. It's the most infuriating thing in the world, isn't it? Because you're just like, yeah, you're right. You can't get mad at them. How can you take like they're owning it? They're saying. And I remember this as a kid. I watched my older brother do it. He got in trouble all the time, but he would apologize and say what my parents were going to say before they said it, just so they couldn't say anything. It was brilliant because I watched my dad's head turn red and he wanted to explode and let him have it, but he couldn't say anything because he already said it. Took the wind right out of him. Now his motives were dodgy, but it was still a brilliant move, right? It's the same thing of how you encourage your team and make a safe space where they can come to you and do that. And that the conversation shifts away from, I'm angry and frustrated because you caused me discomfort. And it comes to, I'm going to come alongside you and we're going to avoid having this happen again because we're in it together. If they don't think they can come and talk to you about it, you're going to have more headaches than it's worth. And if they stop coming to you, well, like I said earlier, they either think that you don't care or that you can't solve the problem. But being able to have that space, you have to do it first. And that goes back to the outcome part. Nobody else can own the outcome but you. The point behind all of this stuff is it helps in the leadership part. It helps in the relational pieces. It'll help in your negotiations when you're doing contracts because you'll hear people talk. Even the smallest things that we just covered, if you hear people talking about, whether they want to get aerated and then fertilizing for the fall season, listen for those words. Oh, I should do that. You'll know probably ahead of time where the conversation is going because your gut's going to tell you he's not invested, they don't want to spend the money. And it'll help you shape your conversation. Or if you know you're heading into a tough quarter and your team's not performing, listen to what they're talking about. How are they talking about it? Get out ahead of it. They're telling you what they need before you even have to ask. If they're performing and it still looks like there's a black cloud over your team or your person, go talk to them. Something's uncomfortable in life, whether they realize it or not. We all get that from our spouse, our friends, like, wow, you look like you want to kill somebody. What's wrong? I don't have a naturally smiley face, so everyone thinks I'm perpetually angry, which I'm not. Thank you. But I get asked that, and I have to be cognizant of what am I portraying? Do I look perpetually angry? And if I do, am I? Some days, sure. Most days, no. Just thinking, just letting the wheels spin. But if I don't address that in any kind of way, I'm not going to encourage my team or anybody to come talk to me, which makes what I do really ironic because I've been in human services for 20 plus years and I have a resting angry face. So I have a lot of explaining to do sometimes. But it gets validated through the relationship pieces and through all the things that I just talked about when I am able to connect with that team and help them understand that what you see isn't what you think it is. But you have to be looking for that in your team. Because 9 times out of 10, if somebody's struggling at work and it's consistent, something outside that space is wrong. It's off. It's a problem. Now, it doesn't mean you got to go own that too. Your boundaries are important. You can love your team. You don't always have to like them, but there's a certain cutoff. You don't become enmeshed in their life. When you do that, emotions become more the governor than process and outcome. If you don't make it clear that this is where we stop, they're going to run all over you, and it's going to make it very difficult to give them directions, corrections, and consequences. Which, when that happens, feeds the inconsistency part because it's more of a pain in the neck than it's worth. So it's a perfect storm of finding your own rhythm with it. But the truth be told is if you don't go through the process yourself first and find out what kind of false narratives, what Kool-Aid you drank from somewhere earlier in life that has governed your perception of self, or give credence to the audience that constantly wants to confront you in certain ways or edit you. If you're married, that's a great place for that. Whoever's closest to you is going to tell you the truth about what you see and hear, and whether you choose to hear it. If you defend yourself, it's natural. But you're also limiting what the truth really is. And there's a safe space to be when you finally say, yes, I don't want to do this. I don't like this. I don't accept this. Because we will constantly edit ourselves and make room for more people with frequency, almost to a point of fault, because a growing frustration will occur. Your team, your wife, your kids, your friends, they're all going through the same negotiation on a regular basis. What we're describing here is a systemic ability to disengage and evaluate without an emotional charge. It's almost like, if you've ever seen The Matrix, you know, he's throwing 55 blocks at that guy and he's just looking at him. It's getting the mindset and the awareness to be in that space and be able to function at the speed that Neo does. While everybody else is 1,000 miles an hour in the instant gratification world, these systems and these ideas allow you to pull back and see the broad picture in a speed of which other people can't, because the emotional messaging is under your control. Anybody have any questions, thoughts on any of that stuff? So the closing piece, and this is often questions that I've posed to numerous clients over the years in various settings. It's always a good one to use with youth in particular because they don't think that far away. But personally, what is the limiting belief that you hold that's based upon someone else's opinion? A lot of times in certain spaces of our life, we will have stopped at an emotional maturity because somebody would have spoken into our life in terms of that character trait and made us feel insecure about it. So we'll process an adult experience at the age of which our maturity got limited by somebody else's imposing of their belief on it. So a crass example is a father telling a son, you're weak, you're dumb, you're incompetent, you're stupid. Any negative messaging, that guy is going to carry that through his life. And so if he's in your employ and he screws up, he's bracing for that. So if he's already got his back raised, odds are somewhere in his backstory somebody told him he ain't worth it. She isn't worth it. So the challenge I pose to people in this is, what's yours? Doesn't mean you got to obviously confess that publicly, but somewhere in there, your perception of you is based upon someone else's approval. It doesn't mean it's the truth, but you let it be the truth for the safety and acceptance of that space you're in. And it has governed probably a lot of the things that you experience today. But facing that requires dealing with anxiety and stress, giving it a voice in a way that doesn't make it have to be good or bad. It just is. It's information to use, to evaluate it, close it out, move forward. In the profession, and this is something I've talked about with folks who kind of arrive at their second career, maybe, or they've been in the same one for a really long time. They're bored. They want to do something different. They don't enjoy what they're doing. One of the things I've always encouraged anybody to do is pursue that which makes you come alive. If you're passionate about what you're doing, it's not a job. It's a life. It's a lifestyle. It's the purpose of living, which is why you can get out of bed every day with excitement, because you're not going to work. You're living out your purpose. To that extent, what's your purpose statement? Why are you on this side of the dirt? Did you figure it out? Anybody ever asked you? Is it to get up and do the 9 to 5 and get the money and do the 2.5 kids and the defense? None of them are wrong, and that's the point, is none of it's wrong. But there's more to why we move and breathe than just what we've come to experience on our hamster wheel of work. If you find yourself in that space, I'm not saying go quit your job and be careless, but challenge the truth of that. What makes you come alive? And if you can figure out a way to make a living doing that, awesome, do it. But pursue it. Because if you don't, generally what we feel is a slight dimming of the light inside. Because all the responsibilities have replaced the things that make us feel passion and purpose. And remember, that's also your team. Mental health for your team is highly important. It gets ignored. 9 times out of 10, when I'm looking at the team I'm leading right now, for instance, and I'm freshly in leadership of them, I've told 2 of them to take days off. Like, yeah, but we got them. Like, you need to take a day off. Go do whatever you need to do to relax. You guys have been through a hard time. You're not helping here. So go decompress and get it together. In the week's time that was able to happen, they came back refreshed, ready to go a little farther, because it was just simple acknowledgement of you look miserable. And this is just a function. This isn't life. And in that, I got a better return of the outcome by giving a crap about their experience, their life. two activities, and I used to do this one when I work with kids when they were in situations that, they were either juvenile detention, intensive psychiatric, foster care. If they could write a headline about the perfect life they wanted, what would they say? A lot of times it was relational. I wish my dad wasn't this way. I wish my mom wasn't that way. I wish I had a family. I wish I didn't have this. It's a pie in the sky that generally wasn't obtainable, but it allowed you to kind of see where they're functioning, what's their space, where they're operating from. As adults, that has a whole different answer. And the reason I can bring that up with confidence is because I had that asked of me, which is the reason I'm standing here today. I would rather do this and make a little bit than keep doing what I was doing and make even a little bit more. Because this makes me come alive. This is what is important to me. My grandmother was a big influence in my life, and her statement was, live a life worth living, or what was the point of being alive? Anybody that's faith-based understands that making the world a better place, it's kind of a prerequisite. And really, what's the point of tearing it down? There's no win there. And so being in the human service field for me was a natural default. I definitely didn't go to school for it, I can tell you that. My father would have a very long explanation of my decisions in that space, but it happened to be something I fell into and I found my passion. So how my career has evolved has not been through a decision of chain climbing. It has been through pursuit of that passion that makes me come alive. It doesn't always have that reward, and it creates its own secondary headaches because in society, people that help people don't generally get paid a lot unless they go into debt really significantly to get the right lettering, but that's why I'm standing here today doing this. That's why this company is starting to grow and evolve and be able to speak to folks like you and challenge some of the narratives that keep us stuck. The second one is the magic wish. If you could have one wish that you could change about your life, what would it be? Not the world, because everybody wants world peace and they want, all that stuff, and infinite money isn't really an option. But what would it be? And everybody has one. That's the thing. I mean, there are people you'll look at and you'll be like, oh, their life is perfect. I bet you if you scratch the surface, they're struggling. Everybody. I mean, it's a human thing. And if you have an answer that's real, why aren't you doing anything about it? I mean, if I was to use a very simple version, which I didn't realize I enjoyed until recently, I would go fish more. It's a simple thing, right? Why don't I do it? Well, because it takes me away from my house, takes me away from my wife, costs money. I mean, we will negotiate the reasons why, and it seems justified why we don't pursue them. But if I really wanted to, I would. And that's the thing of it is, if you want something, you'll do it. Like everybody have dessert today? Why'd you have dessert? If it wasn't in the room, how many of you would have gotten in the car and gotten some? Percentage-wise, I believe that.
I would have Hillary go get it for me.
It's an indicator that as people, if we really want something, we will go get it. If we want something, but the process to obtain it is too much inconvenience, costs too much, we'll negotiate that and then relic it to, it's not worth it. Truth be told, it doesn't change the value we placed on it in the front end. And that goes back to the passion and purpose piece. We'll bury that stuff when we believe it's in the best interest of somebody else, but we're also robbing ourselves of being the truest version of who we are because of who we want to be, because we're worried about other people not accepting it. And remember, that's your team. That's your wife. That's your kids. That's your neighbor. That's your friends. Everybody's doing this dance. And you get to decide the role you play in that space. And so at the end of it, because that was said to me by a college professor, so I thought it was appropriate to end. At the end of the day, wherever you are, it's your doing. If you're miserable, that was your choice. If you're not, that's your choice. And that's a hard pill to swallow is, well, my life sucks because of this, this, and this. Okay, but you still get to pick your perspective. Because if we didn't, how are people halfway across the world that are living in Calcutta, for instance, happy people. So that's the challenge. What are you going to do about it? If your team's not performing, what evaluation of you are you going to do? Who are you going to engage in that process to give you honest feedback of where you're struggling? And what are you going to do about it? Because if you don't adjust, well, then you really do want the problems you have. Because everything is a choice. Somebody puts a gun to your head and you're on a bridge and they say, jump off the bridge, I'm going to shoot you in the head. You still have a choice. If you're struggling and you don't want to hear news about yourself, well, then you're choosing to have the misery instead. Now remember, none of it's wrong, but it's normal. Everyone does it. That's how we negotiate life. And so knowing these things allows you to get in touch with your rhythms, so that way you can start to see those rhythms in the people that you're leading. Because at the end of the day, if you do that, the outcomes are going to take care of themselves. But if you're focused on the outcomes, your best thinking is going to get you as limited as your best thinking can. That's all I got. Anybody have any questions? And that there are things that are much more important. kinds of reactions. Mindset. Diluted. Does anybody like being micromanaged?